My new security job description: protect the property from everything. At this isolated Texas roadside attraction, the shadows have eyes, and the history is chilling. This isn't just about watching monitors. It's about staying alive until dawn when the very air feels like it's trying to drag you into the darkness. You won't believe the rules I have to follow. The Starlight Junction Motor Court sat 47 miles outside of Amarillo, a relic from an era when Route 66 meant something more than faded asphalt and forgotten dreams. I first laid eyes on it during that golden hour before sunset, when the Texas sky bleeds orange and purple across the endless horizon. Even bathed in that warm light, the place looked wrong. Not abandoned exactly, but suspended somehow, like a photograph left too long in the sun until the colors started to separate and bleed. My truck crunched over gravel that hadn't seen regular traffic in what must have been decades. The main building hunched low against the landscape, a sprawling structure of weathered wood and sun-bleached paint that might have once been turquoise. The sign out front still stood, though it tilted at a precarious angle. Starlight Junction, it proclaimed in letters that had lost most of their neon tubes. Last stop before forever. That tagline sent an uncomfortable shiver down my spine, even then, though I told myself it was just clever marketing from the 1950s. The ground spread out in a semicircle around the main building. To the left sat a cluster of detached motor court cabins, their doors hanging open like slack jaws. To the right, what must have been a service station, complete with ancient pumps that probably hadn't dispensed gasoline since Nixon was in office. And everywhere, scattered like toys from a giant's tantrum, were the props and displays that had once made this place a legitimate roadside attraction. A fiberglass cowboy, easily 12 feet tall, loomed near the entrance, his paint-chipped face frozen in a grin that looked more threatening than welcoming. Behind him stood a collection of vintage cars, their chrome dulled by years of dust storms, their windows dark and somehow watchful. There was a covered wagon with a broken wheel, mannequins dressed as pioneers arranged around a fake campfire, a wooden cutout of a Texas longhorn the size of a small house, a teepee made of concrete, inexplicably painted with psychedelic patterns that definitely weren't part of any Native American tradition. The whole place felt like a fever dream of Americana, filtered through decades of neglect and the particular brand of weirdness that seemed to infect these forgotten roadside attractions. I'd stumbled onto the job listing purely by accident, scrolling through my phone at 2 a.m. after another shift at the warehouse ended with pink slips for half the crew. Security guard needed. Overnight shift, Starlight Junction Motor Court. Must be comfortable working alone. Must follow instructions exactly. Excellent pay. The salary listed was nearly triple what I'd been making, which should have been my first warning. Nothing good comes that easy. The interview, if you could call it that, had lasted less than 10 minutes. I'd spoken with a man named Vernon Blackwell over the phone, his voice a gravelly drawl that sounded like cigarettes and secrets. He'd asked me 3 questions. Could I work midnight to 6 a.m.? Was I prone to panic? And did I believe in ghosts? I'd answered yes, no, and I guess I've never thought about it much, in that order. Good enough, Vernon had said. You start Friday. Gate code is 5-7-2-8. Office key will be under the ceramic armadillo by the front door. Don't be late, and for God's sake, don't skip reading the manual. Now, standing in the dying light with that ceramic armadillo in my hand and a rusty key clutched in my palm, I wondered what the hell I'd gotten myself into. The excitement I'd felt when I'd seen that paycheck amount was still there, singing in my veins like electricity. But it was mixing now with something else, something cold that sat heavy in my stomach as I watched the shadows lengthen across the gravel lot. The office was exactly what you'd expect. A cramped room that smelled of old paper and older coffee, dominated by a desk that looked like it had survived a war, and a bank of security monitors that seemed far too modern for the dilapidated surroundings. Someone had invested serious money in the surveillance system. Cameras covered every angle of the property, their feeds displayed across 6 high-definition screens. The contrast between the ancient setting and the cutting-edge technology made my skin prickle. On the desk sat a thermos, still warm, and a plastic container of what looked like homemade cookies. A note rested on top in spidery handwriting for the new night guard. "You'll need the energy. V. Vernon," I assumed. I'd never actually met him in person, and something told me I probably never would. Next to the cookies sat a 3-ring binder, its cover labeled in the same spidery script: "Security Protocols. Read completely before beginning shift." The binder was thick, easily 100 pages, and as I flipped it open, I felt that cold thing in my stomach start to grow. The first page was simple enough. Standard stuff about checking locks, monitoring cameras, logging any vehicles that approached. But by page 3, things had taken a turn. By page 10, I was reading with my mouth slightly open, certain this had to be some kind of elaborate joke. Rule number 7. If you hear knocking on any door or window, do not respond. Do not look toward the source of the knocking. Continue your current task, as if nothing occurred. The knocking will stop on its own. Rule number 12. Between the hours of 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., you may notice movement in your peripheral vision. This is expected. Do not turn to look directly at any movement during this time. Keep your eyes focused on the monitors or your logbook. Rule number 19. If the temperature in the office drops suddenly and you can see your breath, immediately stand and recite the following. This is a place of business. You are not welcome during business hours. Please return when we are closed. Do not leave the office until the temperature returns to normal. There were 47 rules in total, each one more bizarre than the last. Some are mundane, almost disappointingly normal. Others made my hand shake as I read them. Rule number 23 advised what to do if I saw someone standing in cabin 7's doorway. Rule number 31 explained the proper protocol if the vintage car's headlights turn on by themselves. Rule number 38, in bold red ink, unlike any other rule, simply said, if you hear a child laughing, leave immediately. Do not return until sunrise. You will not be penalized for abandoning your shift under this circumstance. I sat there in that office, reading and rereading the rules as darkness swallowed the world outside. The monitors glowed with their night vision feeds, turning the familiar roadside attraction into an alien landscape of green shadows and impossible angles. My watch ticked toward midnight, each second feeling heavier than the last. This wasn't just a security job. These weren't quirky rules from an eccentric boss. This was a survival guide. And as I watched something that might have been a shadow but moved wrong glide across the screen showing cabin 3, I realized with a clarity that froze my blood. Every single one of these rules had been written because someone, at some point, had needed them. The question that burned in my mind as the clock struck 12 wasn't whether I should leave. The money was too good, and my bank account too empty. The question was simpler and infinitely more terrifying. Which rule would I break first, and what would happen when I did? The first hour passed in silence, so complete I could hear my own heartbeat drumming in my ears. I sat at the desk, the security manual open in front of me, forcing myself to commit each rule to memory. Some made a twisted kind of sense, the kind of sense you might find in a nightmare. Others seemed designed specifically to unsettle, as if the mere act of following them would acknowledge that something fundamentally wrong existed in this place. Rule number 3 stated I should check each monitor in sequence, left to right, spending no more than 15 seconds on each screen. Never linger, it warned. Prolonged observation may attract attention. I didn't know who or what's attention I might attract by looking too long at a video feed, and the manual didn't elaborate. It never elaborated. Each rule was stated as simple fact, with no explanation, no context, nothing that might make the instructions seem less insane. I found myself watching the monitor showing the main lot, where that massive fiberglass cowboy stood grinning into the darkness. In the night vision's green glow, his smile looked predatory. 15 seconds, I reminded myself, then forced my eyes to the next screen. The motor court cabins, the service station, the covered wagon and its ring of pioneer mannequins, the concrete teepee, back to the office exterior. Then the sequence started again. Rule number 5. Check the locks on the office door every hour. When checking, recite the time aloud. The sound of your voice maintains the boundary. I'd read that line 6 times before I'd fully processed what it was suggesting. My voice maintained the boundary, as if the locked door wasn't enough. As if something might try to come in that cared nothing for simple physical barriers like wood and metal. At 12:47 a.m., I made my first hourly check. The door was locked, solid wood with a deadbolt that looked new despite the building's age. 12:47, I said aloud, my voice sounding strange in the quiet. All secure. The words felt foolish, like a child's magical incantation. But I said them anyway, because the manual told me to. And the manual was written by someone who had survived enough nights here to know it worked. Rule number 8 was one of the simpler ones, almost mundane. Do not eat food from the thermos or container unless you witness yourself pouring or opening it. I'd already drunk half the thermos's coffee and eaten 2 cookies before I'd read that far. The realization made my stomach clench. But nothing happened. The coffee sat in my belly, warm and normal, and the cookies had tasted like someone's grandmother made them, sweet and slightly crispy at the edges. Maybe that rule was just paranoia, or maybe I'd gotten lucky. At 1:15, I logged my first notation in the security logbook, another requirement spelled out in rule number 11. All quiet. No anomalies observed. The manual had provided a list of what constituted an anomaly. The list was 3 pages long. It included things like unexplained sounds, temperature fluctuations, feelings of being watched, movement in empty spaces, and, chillingly, the presence of people who weren't there before. That last one stuck with me. The presence of people who weren't there before. Not strangers on the property or unauthorized visitors. People who weren't there before, as if they might simply materialize from nothing. As if the act of existing was something that didn't apply to whatever walked these grounds at night. Rule number 14 told me to ignore any sounds of vehicles approaching. Several times per night, you will hear engines, tire sounds, and car doors closing. The monitors will show nothing. This is normal. Do not investigate. Do not go outside to check. I hadn't heard anything yet. But knowing it was coming made every small noise seemed loaded with potential threat. The office had a small bathroom attached, just a toilet and sink in a closet-sized space. Rule number 20 covered it. Use the bathroom only when necessary. Before entering, knock 3 times and count to 10. If you hear any sound from inside during the count, wait 5 minutes and try again. Never enter if you hear a response. That rule made me determined to hold my bladder for the entire shift, no matter how much coffee I consumed. At 1:33, I was cycling through the monitors again when I saw it. Just a flicker, really, on the screen showing cabin 7. Movement in the doorway. There and gone so fast, I couldn't be sure I'd seen anything at all. My hand froze on the desk. I wanted to look longer, to rewind the footage, to confirm. But rule number 23 flashed through my mind. If you see someone standing in cabin 7's doorway, do not stare. Do not try to get a better look. Make a note in the log and continue your rounds. Prolonged observation may cause it to move closer. My pen shook as I wrote. 1:33 a.m. Possible movement, cabin 7. Logged per protocol. The words looked absurd on paper. Too clinical for the ice that had suddenly formed in my chest. Prolonged observation may cause it to move closer. What did that mean? Closer to the cabin door? Closer to the office? Closer to me? I kept my eyes moving through the monitors, 15 seconds each, just like the rules said. When cabin 7 came up in the rotation again, the doorway was empty. Just darkness beyond the open door, the interior invisible to the cameras. I moved on. Rule number 16 had seemed bizarre when I first read it. If you smell lilacs, open the window behind the desk exactly 3 inches. No more, no less. Leave it open for 5 minutes, then close it. Do not look out the window during this time. At 1:48, the scent hit me like a physical thing, sweet and overwhelmingly strong, far too powerful to be natural. There were no lilac bushes on the property. I was certain of that. I'd walked the grounds before sunset, had seen the scrub brush and hardy desert plants that made up the landscaping. My hands trembled as I measured the window opening, using my phone to make sure it was exactly 3 inches. The night air that flowed in was cold, far colder than it should have been for a Texas autumn night. I kept my eyes on the desk, on my watch counting down the minutes, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to look outside, to see what was out there that required this strange appeasement. When 5 minutes passed, I closed the window and locked it. The scent of lilacs faded immediately, as if it had never been there at all. My log entry, 1:48 a.m., lilac protocol followed, completed without incident. Without incident. The phrase tasted like a lie. The rules continued to reveal themselves not as abstract guidelines, but as immediate, necessary instructions. Rule number 27. If the lights flicker once, ignore it. If they flicker twice, stand and face the door. If they flicker 3 times, leave the building immediately and return at sunrise. At 2:03, the overhead fluorescence flickered. Once. My entire body tensed, waiting. The light remained steady. I exhaled and made another note. But it was rule number 12 that dominated my thoughts as the clock crept toward 2 a.m. Between the hours of 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., you may notice movement in your peripheral vision. This is expected. Do not turn to look directly at any movement during this time. Keep your eyes focused on the monitors or your logbook. I'd read that rule a dozen times, and each reading made it worse. You may notice movement, not you might imagine movement, or you could see shadows. You will notice movement as a simple fact, something as reliable as the sunrise. At 2:01 it began, a flicker at the edge of my vision, off to my left where the filing cabinet stood. I locked my eyes on the center monitor, forcing myself to focus on the green-tinted image of the service station. Another flicker, this time to my right. Something moving past the water cooler. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. The manual was explicit. Do not look. The movement continued for the entire hour. Sometimes quick, like someone darting past. Sometimes slow, like a shadow sliding across a wall. Once, I could have sworn something passed directly between me and the monitors, momentarily blocking my view. But I kept my eyes forward, kept my breathing steady, kept my hand from shaking too obviously as I went through the motions of my job. I logged vehicles that didn't exist. I monitored feeds that showed nothing but empty buildings and dusty props. I followed rules that made no logical sense, but felt absolutely vital, as if each one was the only thing standing between me and something that waited in the dark, patient and hungry. At 3:01, the peripheral movement stopped. The office felt suddenly empty, as if a crowd had just left. The silence that rushed and was almost worse than the activity had been, because now I had to wonder where those things had gone. Were they still there, just still? Or had they moved outside, to other parts of the property? Rule number 32 answered that unasked question with chilling efficiency. After 3 a.m., you may hear sounds from the roof. Footsteps, scraping, or other impacts. This is expected. Do not investigate. Do not go outside. The sound will stop before sunrise. And sure enough, at 3:17, something heavy dragged itself across the roof above my head. The sound was wet somehow, organic in a way that made my skin crawl. It moved slowly from one end of the building to the other, then back again. then stopped. I sat there in that office, surrounded by rules that acknowledge horrors without naming them, and realized that I'd stopped questioning whether this was real. The only question that mattered now was whether I could make it to sunrise. The manual had 47 rules. I'd experienced maybe a dozen so far. The night was far from over, and with each passing minute, I understood more clearly that every single rule existed because someone had learned, probably the hard way, exactly what happened when you broke it. My watch showed 3:34 a.m., 2.5 hours until sunrise. 2.5 hours of following instructions designed to keep me alive in a place where the normal rules of reality seemed negotiable at best. I poured more coffee from the thermos with shaking hands, grateful it wasn't cold yet, and turned my attention back to the monitors. Cabin 7's doorway was empty. The fiberglass cowboy grinned his eternal grin. The Pioneer mannequins sat frozen around their fake fire. Everything looked normal. Everything looked wrong. And I was starting to understand that at Starlight Junction, there was no difference between the two. The coffee had gone cold in my cup, forgotten somewhere between rule number 29 and the sound of footsteps that weren't supposed to exist. I've been telling myself for the past 4 hours that everything had an explanation. Old buildings settle. Wind carries sounds. Exhaustion creates shadows where none exist. The human brain is hardwired to find patterns in threats and randomness. Every psychology course I'd ever taken had armed me with rational explanations for irrational experiences. But rationalization is a fragile thing, and the universe has a way of shattering it when it gets tired of your denial. It was 4:12 a.m. when my skepticism died. Not gradually, not with a whimper of uncertainty, but suddenly and completely, murdered by something I couldn't explain away no matter how desperately I wanted to. I was on my third cycle through the monitors since 3 a.m., my eyes gritty with exhaustion and the strain of staring at screens. The sequence had become automatic. Main lot, cabins, service station, covered wagon, teepee, office exterior, repeat. 15 seconds each, never lingering. My mind had started to wander, thinking about how I'd spend that first paycheck, whether this job would still seem worth it when the sun came up, whether I should start looking for an apartment closer to the property, or if that was a profoundly stupid idea. Then I looked at the monitor showing the service station. The ancient gas pumps stood in their usual positions, angular and skeletal in the night vision's glow. The building behind them was dark, its windows empty. Everything exactly as it should be. I was about to move to the next screen when something in the image changed. One of the gas pumps began to move. Not the whole thing, just the nozzle, hanging from its cradle on the side of the pump. It lifted slowly, rising from its resting position as if someone had picked it up. But there was no one there. The monitor showed empty space around the pump, nothing but gravel and shadows. The nozzle hung suspended in the air for a moment, then began to move in a deliberate arc, extending outward as if to pump gas into an invisible vehicle. I sat frozen, my hand halfway to my coffee cup, watching the impossible unfold on screen. The hose stretched taut as the nozzle moved farther from the pump. Then it stopped, held steady in midair for 10, 15, 20 seconds. Finally, with the same slow deliberation, it returned to its cradle and settled back into place. The entire event lasted maybe 45 seconds. 45 seconds that shattered 4 hours of carefully maintained skepticism. Because there was no wind strong enough to lift a gas pump nozzle and make it move in such a controlled manner. There was no animal that could manipulate it like that. There was no rational explanation that fit what I just witnessed. I checked the other monitors frantically, looking for anything else out of place. Everything appeared normal, but normal didn't mean what it used to. Normal had been redefined. I grabbed the manual with shaking hands and flipped through it, looking for any rule that covered this situation. The closest I found was rule number 31. If the vintage car's headlights turn on by themselves, note the time and the number of vehicles affected. Do not approach the vehicles. The activity will cease on its own. That wasn't quite the same thing, but it was close enough to terrify me. The manual had anticipated this. Someone had seen things move on their own before. Many times, probably, if they'd bothered to write a rule about it. And that person hadn't written, if you think you see, or if you believe you witnessed. They'd written, if, with the calm certainty of someone describing sunrise. Because at Starlight Junction, objects moved by themselves as predictably as the earth rotated. My log entry was brief because my hand was shaking too hard to write more. 4:12 a.m. Movement observed at service station. Gas pump nozzle. Self-animated. Duration approximately 45 seconds. The words looked insane on paper. If someone read this during an insurance claim or an investigation, they'd think I'd been drinking or hallucinating. But the timestamp would be there on the security footage. Whatever I'd seen, the cameras had recorded it. Proof that my sanity, at least, remained intact, even if reality itself had gotten negotiable. I tried to settle back into the routine. Monitor rotation, 15 seconds each. But my heart was hammering now, adrenaline singing through my veins, every shadow seeming to pulse with potential threat. The office felt smaller somehow, the walls closer. The darkness outside the windows felt thicker, more substantial, like something you could touch if you were brave enough or stupid enough to try. At 4:31, I heard the knocking. 3 distinct raps on the office door, sharp and clear. My whole body went rigid. Rule number 7 blazed through my mind. If you hear knocking on any door or window, do not respond. Do not look toward the source of the knocking. Continue your current task, as if nothing occurred. The knocking will stop on its own. I kept my eyes locked on the monitors. 3 more knocks, harder this time, more insistent. The sound echoed in the small office, demanding attention, demanding response. Every social instinct I had screamed at me to call out, to ask who was there, to check the security feed for the office exterior. But I just watched the gas pump operate itself. I'd read 47 rules written by someone who'd survived this place. I knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that opening that door, or even looking at it, would be the last mistake I ever made. The knocking came again. Then again, a rhythm started to form, almost like a song, like something was tapping out a melody on the wooden door. My hands gripped the edge of the desk, so hard my knuckles went white. I forced myself to focus on the screen in front of me, to narrate what I was seeing in a whisper, just to give my mind something to hold on to. Main lot. Clear. Cowboy statue. Undisturbed. Vintage cars. All present. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, loaded with the weight of something waiting just outside, something patient enough to try a different approach. I didn't look at the door. I didn't check the exterior monitor, though it took every ounce of willpower I possessed. I just continued the rotation, pretending nothing had happened, maintaining the fiction that I was alone, even though we both knew better now. At 4:47, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had opened a freezer door in a small room. My breath suddenly fogged in front of my face, visible even in the dim light from the monitors. Ice formed on the inside of the windows, intricate patterns spreading across the glass like crystallized thought. Rule number 19. I stood so fast my chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "This is a place of business," I said, my voice sounding thin and scared even to my own ears. "You are not welcome during business hours. Please return when we are closed." The words felt simultaneously ridiculous and vital, a verbal ward against something I couldn't see, but could definitely feel, a presence that filled the suddenly frigid air like smoke. The cold lingered for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, it vanished. The temperature normalized. The ice on the windows began to melt, leaving trails like tears on the glass. I slumped back into my chair, my legs weak, my whole body trembling, not just from the cold, but from the realization of what had just happened. Something had been in here with me, not outside knocking, but inside, sharing the same air, the same space. And I'd had to ask it to leave like it was some kind of overstaying customer. The absurdity would have made me laugh if I hadn't been so close to crying. I logged both incidents, my handwriting barely legible now. The night was taking its toll, burning through my reserves of courage and rationality, leaving behind only a kind of numb determination to see sunrise. I had an hour and 13 minutes left, just over 70 minutes. I could do this. People had done this before, night after night. The manual existed. The rules worked. I just had to follow them. At 5:02, I heard the vehicles. Engines rumbling, tires on gravel, the distinctive sound of car doors opening and closing. Lots of them, like a parking lot filling up at rush hour. But the monitors showed nothing. The main lot remained empty except for the vintage cars and props, undisturbed and silent. Rule number 14 had warned me about this, had told me it was normal, had emphasized that I should not investigate. The phantom sounds continued for 15 minutes. Engines idling. People talking in low voices I couldn't quite make out. Footsteps on gravel. At one point, I could have sworn I heard a child laughing, and my blood turned to ice. But it wasn't quite laughter, not the pure sound that rule number 38 warned about. It was more like an echo of laughter, a memory of it, distant and distorted. Still, I kept my hand on my keys, ready to bolt if the sound clarified into something that meant I had to abandon my shift. The phantom parking lot faded around 5:17. The silence that returned felt empty now, hollow, like the world had been scooped out and left waiting. Dawn was coming. I could feel it in a way the darkness outside had changed texture, becoming less absolute, preparing to retreat. 43 minutes until sunrise. 43 minutes until I could leave this place and pretend, at least until the next shift, that the world made sense. At 5:34, with the sky just beginning to lighten at the edges, something appeared on the monitor showing the covered wagon. One of the Pioneer mannequins had moved, or something wearing the mannequin's clothes had taken its place, because what I was seeing sat too naturally, moved too fluidly to be fiberglass and paint. It turned its head slowly toward the camera, and even through the night vision's distortion, even though I couldn't make out real details, I saw its eyes. They reflected the infrared light like an animal's, twin points of brightness in a face that should not have been capable of expression. It looked directly at the camera, directly at me, and it smiled. Then it was just a mannequin again, frozen in its original position, empty-eyed and inanimate. But I'd seen what I'd seen. The boundary between prop and presence was thinner here than anywhere else in the world, and whatever walked the Starlight Junction at night could slip between the two as easily as breathing. My last log entry before dawn was the simplest. 5:34 a.m. Aware it knows I'm watching. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The manual had been right about everything else. Someone would read that entry and understand exactly what it meant. Someone who'd sat in this chair before me, who'd watched the same monitors, who'd felt the same cold dread settling into their bones with each impossible occurrence. At 5:59, I began the end-of-shift procedures outlined in rule number 43. I closed and locked the manual. I powered down the monitors in sequence. I checked the door one final time. 5:59, I said to the empty office. Shift concluding. All secure. The words felt more like a plea than a confirmation. At exactly 6 a.m., I opened the door. The sunrise was breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed impossibly pure after the night I'd just survived. The Starlight Junction Motor Court looked almost normal in the dawn light, just another forgotten piece of Americana, quirky and sad rather than threatening. But I knew better now. I'd learned what the shadows hid, what the darkness brought, what waited patiently for night to fall again. And as I walked to my truck, I could feel eyes on my back, watching from windows and doorways and places that existed in the space between, counting down the hours until they could move freely again. I had survived one night. The question that haunted me as I drove away, the morning sun warm on my face, was whether I'd be stupid enough or desperate enough to come back for another. I told myself I wouldn't return. I spent that entire Saturday in my apartment, curtains drawn, jumping at every sound, replaying the night in my mind with a kind of obsessive detail usually reserved for trauma victims. The gas pump nozzle floating in midair, the knocking that wouldn't stop, the mannequin that wasn't a mannequin looking directly at me through the camera. Every moment felt both hyper-real and impossible, like memories from someone else's nightmare. But Sunday evening, as the sun started its descent, I found myself driving back towards Starlight Junction. The money was part of it, sure. 3 weeks' pay from this job equaled 3 months at any normal position. But that wasn't really why I went back. The truth, which I barely wanted to admit to myself, was that I needed to know if it had been real, if I'd truly seen what I thought I'd seen, or if exhaustion and suggestion had created monsters from shadows and wind. The property looked different the second time, not in any way I could articulate, but I felt at the moment my truck turned off the highway onto that gravel access road. The air tasted wrong, metallic and thick. The light seemed to bend strangely around the buildings, creating angles that hurt to look at directly. Or maybe I was just primed now, aware of what hid beneath a mundane surface, seeing the wrongness I'd been too ignorant to notice before. The office was exactly as I'd left it. The manual sat on the desk, closed and waiting. The thermos had been refilled, steam rising from the pour spout. Fresh cookies sat in a new container. Vernon, or whoever prepared these things, worked unseen hours, maintaining the space for guardians who protected something that probably shouldn't be protected. Part of me wanted to meet Vernon, to ask him how long he'd been doing this, how many guards had sat in this chair, how many had lasted more than a handful of nights. But a bigger part of me didn't want those answers, didn't want to know the attrition rate or the reasons people left. I opened the manual and started reading from the beginning, even though I practically memorized it during my first shift. The rules felt different now, weighted with experience. They weren't abstract guidelines anymore, but survival instructions I'd tested in real time. I'd followed rule number 7, and the knocking had stopped. I'd followed rule number 19, and the cold presence had left. The manual worked. That was both comforting and absolutely terrifying. At 11:47, 13 minutes before my shift officially began, I noticed something new. A 48th rule had been added to the manual, written in the same spidery handwriting as the others, but in fresh ink that hadn't quite dried. Rule number 48. Do not tell the property that you know it's watching. Acknowledgement invites interaction. My stomach dropped. My last log entry flashed through my mind, aware it knows I'm watching. I'd written that. I'd acknowledged it. And someone had read my log, understood what I'd meant, and added a new rule specifically about that very thing. Acknowledgement invites interaction. What did that mean? What had I invited? The clock struck midnight before I could fully process the implications. The shift began. The monitors flickered to life with their familiar green-tinted feeds. And immediately, I knew something had changed. The property felt more aware somehow, more present, like it had been sleeping during my first shift, but was wide awake now, paying attention, curious about the new guard who'd proven he could see. The first hour passed quietly enough, almost mockingly normal. I followed the monitor rotation, made my hourly log check, logged the standard all-quiet notation. But the silence felt loaded, anticipatory, like the pause before a storm breaks. At 1:17, all 6 monitors went black simultaneously. Not flickering, not losing signal gradually, just instant, complete blackness. My heart hammered against my ribs. I checked the power cables, the connections. Everything was plugged in, secure. The monitors themselves were still on, their screens glowing that empty black that meant they were receiving nothing. Rule number 36 covered this, buried deep in the manual. If all monitors lose signal simultaneously, remain calm. Do not attempt to fix them. Do not leave the office to check cameras manually. They will restore on their own within 10 minutes. During this time, focus on a logbook. Write what you remember about your life before this job. Write what you remember about your life before this job. The instruction seemed bizarre until I started writing. My name, my age, where I grew up, the names of my parents, my childhood friends. Details that should have been effortless to recall, but felt suddenly slippery, like trying to grab smoke. Had my mother's name been Patricia or Priscilla? Had I lived on Oak Street or Oakmont Drive? The memories were there, but fading at the edges, becoming uncertain. I wrote faster, fighting against the strange fog that seemed to be settling over my past. The college I'd attended, the jobs I'd held, the apartment I live in now. Concrete details that anchored me to a reality outside these walls, outside this property where the normal rules didn't apply. 5 minutes passed. 7. The memories started to solidify again, coming back into focus as I wrote them down. At exactly 10 minutes, the monitors flickered back to life. But what they showed made me wish they'd stay dark. Every screen displayed the same image. The office exterior camera, showing my truck parked in its spot, except there was someone standing next to it. A figure in dark clothes, completely still, facing the office, facing me. The night vision made it impossible to see details, but the proportions were wrong somehow. Too tall, or too thin, or both. And it was standing in a position that should have been impossible, given the camera angles. Every monitor showed the same view, which meant every camera on the property had somehow reoriented to point at this single figure. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold my pen. This wasn't in the rules. There was no protocol for this. The closest was rule number 23 about cabin 7, but that specifically said not to stare, to move on. These were all the monitors I had. There was nowhere else to look. The figure began to move, not walking, but gliding, its feet not quite touching the gravel. It approached the office slowly, deliberately, getting larger on every screen as it drew closer. I could see more details now. It wore what might have been clothes from another era, or might have been shadows that mimic clothing. Where its face should have been was a pale blur, featureless except for 2 dark spots that might have been eyes. 20 feet from the office. 15. 10. I gripped the edge of the desk, every muscle locked, unable to move or cry out or do anything but watch this thing approach. It reached the office wall, its blank face filling the screens, and then it turned. Not away, but 90 degrees, as if it was walking along the wall itself, defying gravity. It circled the building once, twice, moving in that strange, gliding motion, visible on each monitor in sequence as it passed the cameras. Then it stopped directly outside the door. I could hear it now, or feel it, maybe a presence that made the air pressure change like before a thunderstorm. The door handle began to turn, slowly, testing the lock. Once, twice, 3 times. The deadbolt held, but I remembered rule number 5 about maintaining the boundary with my voice. 1:43 a.m. I croaked, my voice barely functioning. All secure, all secure, all secure. I repeated it like a mantra, like a prayer, until the door handle stopped moving. The presence outside lingered for what felt like hours, but was probably only 5 minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The monitors flickered and returned to their normal views. The office exterior camera showed my truck, alone in its parking spot. The gravel where the figure had stood was undisturbed. I sat there shaking, my breath coming in short gasps, my log entry for this event nearly illegible. 1:43 a.m. Full system anomaly. Visitor at door. Breach attempted. Boundary held. The clinical language felt absurd for what I'd just experienced, but what else could I write? Something from beyond human comprehension to try to get in wouldn't look good in any official record. The next 2 hours passed in a state of hypervigilance that bordered on panic. Every sound, every flicker on the monitors, every shift in air pressure sent adrenaline flooding through my system. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. I'd abandoned the coffee because my heart was already racing fast enough to hurt. At 3:52, I heard the voices. Not the phantom parking lot sounds from my first night, but actual voices, distinct and clear, coming from somewhere inside the office. They were having a conversation just behind me, casual and relaxed, as if two people were standing in the small space discussing something mundane. I couldn't make out the words exactly, but the tone was conversational, almost friendly. Rule number 7 said, ignore voices. Don't respond. But that was about knocking. Was this the same thing? I flipped frantically through the manual, looking for the right rule. Rule number 26. If you hear conversations in the office when you know you're alone, do not turn around. Do not try to see the speakers. They are not talking to you. They are echoes of something that happened here before. Let them finish their conversation. They will fade. Echoes. The word should have been comforting, suggesting mere recordings rather than active presences. But it wasn't comforting at all, because it raised the question of what had happened in this office that was so significant it left echoes in the fabric of reality itself. What conversations have been so important, so charged with meaning or emotion, that they continued to replay years or decades later? The voices went on for 12 minutes. At one point, one of them laughed, a warm, genuine sound that was somehow more disturbing than any of the night's horrors because it was so human. Then they faded, thinning out like smoke until silence returned. At 4:15, the temperature dropped again. But this time, when I spoke the words from rule number 19, nothing happened. The cold intensified instead, frost spreading across every surface, my breath forming clouds so thick I could barely see the monitors. I stood and repeated the phrase, louder this time, trying to sound authoritative rather than terrified. This is a place of business. You are not welcome during business hours. Please return when we are closed. The cold pressed closer, and for the first time, I felt something I can only describe as malevolence. Not the neutral strangeness of the gas pump or the mannequin, but something actively hostile. Something that didn't just exist in this space, but wanted to cause harm. The lights flickered once. Twice. My heart stopped. 3 flickers meant evacuate immediately, but they steadied after the second. I grabbed the manual desperately, looking for any other rule that might apply. Rule number 40, which I had skimmed over before. If the cold presence doesn't respond to the standard dismissal, repeat the phrase 3 times while walking in a circle clockwise around the office. Do not stop moving until the temperature normalizes. I started walking, circling the small space, repeating the phrase over and over. My legs felt weak, my balance uncertain, but I kept moving, kept speaking. 1 full circle, 2, 3, 4. On the 5th circuit, the cold began to retreat. By the 7th, the temperature had returned to normal. I slumped against the desk, gasping, my muscles burning from tension and adrenaline. The thing that terrified me most wasn't that the presence had come back. It was that the rules had escalated. First shift, the standard phrase worked immediately. Second shift, I had to add movement, repetition, more effort. What would the 3rd shift require? What happened when a rule stopped working altogether? At 5:04, with less than an hour until sunrise, something appeared on the monitor showing the concrete teepee. A figure sat in its entrance, but unlike the tall, wrong-proportioned thing from earlier, this one looked almost human. Almost. It wore what might have been Native American clothing from a century ago, but the details were blurred, indistinct, like a photograph slowly degrading. As I watched, it raised one hand and beckoned toward the camera. Rule number 29. If anything gestures at the cameras, turn away immediately. Count to 100 before looking again. responding to gestures, even by watching, creates a connection. I spun my chair around, facing the wall, and started counting. My voice shook as I reached 20, 30, 40. At 73, I heard footsteps, not on the roof this time, but inside the office, approaching from behind. Slow, measured steps on the linoleum floor. Every instinct screamed at me to turn, to see what was coming, but I kept my eyes locked on the water-stained wall and kept counting. 86, 87, 88. The footsteps stopped directly behind my chair. I felt breath on the back of my neck, cold and smelling of earth and old copper. 92, 93, 94. Something touched my shoulder, a pressure that felt like fingers but wrong somehow. Too many joints are not enough. 97, 98, 99, 100. I opened my eyes, still facing the wall, afraid to turn. The presence was gone. The office felt empty again. Slowly, hard hammering, I rotated my chair back toward the monitors. The teepee entrance was empty. Everything looked normal. But on my shoulder, where I felt that touch, my shirt had 5 holes burned through it. Perfectly round, arranged like fingertips, but slightly too far apart to be human. The last hour passed in a blur of raw fear barely held in check. I followed every rule perfectly, obsessively, checking and rechecking the manual. I logged every incident in detail, my handwriting degrading in a desperate scrawl as exhaustion and terror took their toll. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. At 5:51, 9 minutes before shift end, the manual fell open by itself to a page I'd never noticed before, inserted between rule number 41 and rule number 42. The page was blank except for one sentence in that familiar spidery handwriting. Some guards never leave. We're not sure if they chose to stay or if the property chose for them. I stared at that sentence, its implications settling over me like a burial shroud. The day guards Vernon had mentioned in passing. The person who refilled the thermos and left fresh cookies. Were they real people working daylight hours? Or were they echoes like the voices? Were they guards who'd stayed too long, seen too much, become part of Starlight Junction's strange reality? At 6 a.m. exactly, I burst out of that office like it was on fire. The sunrise had never looked so beautiful, so solid and real and safe. I didn't look back at the property as I drove away, afraid of what I might see watching from the windows. But in my rearview mirror, just before the Starlight Junction disappeared behind a curve, I could have sworn I saw that tall figure standing in the main lot, perfectly still, watching my truck retreat. I'd survived 2 nights, but survival felt less like victory and more like a temporary reprieve. Because I knew, with the certainty of someone who'd crossed a boundary they could never fully recross, that the property had noticed me now. It knew I could see it, knew I acknowledged its presence. An acknowledgement, as rule number 48 warned, invited interaction. The question wasn't whether I'd go back. The money and morbid curiosity would bring me back. I knew that already. The question was how many more nights I could survive before I became one of the echoes, one of the presences, one of the things future guards would have to ignore and log and survive. How many nights before I stopped leaving at all? I didn't work the next night. Couldn't. I called the number Vernon had given me for emergencies and told the voicemail I was sick, food poisoning. We'll be back Tuesday. My voice shook even leaving that simple message, and I hated myself for it. But spending Monday night in my apartment with every light blazing felt like the bare minimum requirement for sanity. I tried to research Starlight Junction during those empty daylight hours. Tried and failed. The internet had almost nothing. A few historical photos showing the place in its 1950s heyday, full of smiling tourists and gleaming chrome. An article from 1987 about its closure as a tourist attraction, citing declining highway traffic and changing travel patterns. Nothing about deaths, disappearances, paranormal activity. Nothing that would explain the rules or the presences or why someone would pay premium wages for a job that required a 47-rule survival guide. The silence itself felt suspicious. Places with that much wrongness usually left traces, accumulated stories, built reputations. But Starlight Junction existed in a strange void of public knowledge, as if something had carefully erased its footprint from collective memory, or as if people who learned its secrets didn't live long enough, or stay sane enough, to spread them. Tuesday night came too quickly. I spent the drive back rehearsing excuses to quit, planning a conversation where I'd thank Vernon politely and explain I found other work. But when I pulled into that gravel lot, the excuses died in my throat. The property looked different again, not threatening this time, but almost welcoming. The sunset painted the old buildings in warm gold light. The fiberglass cowboy's grin seemed less menacing. Even the tilted sign looked charming rather than ominous. It was showing me what I wanted to see. I realized, trying to lure me back, make me comfortable. The property wasn't just aware. It was intelligent, and it wanted me here. The manual had 3 new rules. Rule number 49. Do not work more than 5 consecutive nights. After the 5th night, take at least 3 nights off. The property forms attachments. Rule number 50. If you find yourself unable to leave at 6 a.m., call the emergency number immediately. You have a 2-hour window before the attachment becomes permanent. Rule number 51. Never say you belong here, even in jest. Words have power on this property. They create bindings. I read these new additions with growing dread. They were written for me, added after my last shift. Vernon, or whoever maintained this manual, was watching the logs, tracking what happened, adjusting the rules to keep guard alive. But the escalation terrified me. 3 shifts in, and already I needed warnings about attachments and bindings. How fast did this place consume people? The shift started normally enough. I become almost comfortable with the baseline strangeness. The minor anomalies that I now understood were just background radiation from whatever made Starlight Junction wrong. Peripheral movement between 2 and 3 a.m. Expected. Phantom parking lot sounds. Standard. Temperature drops. Manageable with the right protocols. But at 1:28, something new happened. The office door opened. Not the handle turning. Not someone forcing the lock. The door simply swung open, smooth and silent, as if I'd left it unlocked even though I knew I hadn't. Cold night air flooded in, carrying scent of desert sage and something else, something rotten and sweet like flowers on a grave. There was no rule for this. Nothing in the manual covered the door opening on its own. My mind raced through possibilities. Should I close it? Lock it again? Speak the boundary maintenance phrase? Or was the open door itself a test? An invitation I was supposed to decline? I stood frozen, indecisive, as something began to materialize in the doorway. Not the tall figure from before, but something worse because it was so achingly familiar. A woman, middle-aged, wearing a security guard uniform identical to mine. She looked solid, real, her details sharp and clear in the office light. She smiled at me, warm and reassuring. "First week's the hardest," she said, her voice perfectly normal, human, kind. "Gets easier once you understand what it wants." Every instinct screamed that this was a trick, a lure, something wearing a human shape to make me lower my guard. But she looked so real, so genuine. And part of me desperately wanted to believe someone else understood. Someone else had survived long enough to offer guidance. "What does it want?" I heard myself ask, my voice small. Her smile widened, still warm, still reassuring, but something shifted in her eyes. Something hungry, to be acknowledged, to be remembered, to keep pieces of us here when we leave. She stepped fully into the office. "You've already given it some pieces, you know. Every rule you follow, every log entry you make, every night you return. You're weaving yourself into this place." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. She took another step closer. It's not so bad, really. Becoming part of something eternal. The loneliness ends. The fear ends. You just have to stop trying to leave. Get out. The words came from somewhere deep, instinctive. You're not welcome during business hours. She laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. Oh, honey, I work here. We all work here. Forever. Her form began to flicker, becoming translucent. Through her body, I could see the doorway, empty except for darkness. See you soon, when you stop fighting it. Then she was gone. The door remained open, that cold air still flowing in, and I realized this was the actual test. Close the door myself, or leave it open. The manual said nothing, but rule number 5 talked about maintaining the boundary. I crossed the office on shaking legs and pushed the door shut. Through the deadbolt, checked it twice. 1:32 a.m. I said loudly, "Boundary secure. All secure." The cold air stopped immediately, but her words lingered, poisonous and insidious. "You're weaving yourself into this place." Was that true? Every night I returned, was I becoming more entangled in whatever web Starlight Junction spun? The holes burned in my shirt from that touch hadn't faded. If anything, they'd grown slightly larger. Physical evidence that the property could mark me, change me, claim pieces of me. At 3:47, I heard my name, not from inside the office, but from multiple locations simultaneously. The monitors showed it visually, my name spelled out in objects arranged deliberately. In the main lot, vintage car doors positioned to form the letters. At the service station, gas pump nozzles oriented into a pattern. In front of cabin 7, footprints in the dust, small ones, child-sized, walking a path that traced out my first and last name. I wasn't in the manual yet. This particular horror didn't have a rule, but the message was clear. The property knew who I was now. Not just that I existed, but my specific identity, the name I carried. And as any folk magic practitioner could tell you, knowing someone's true name gave you power over them. I grabbed my phone, photographed the monitor screens, evidence I might need later to prove I hadn't imagined this. Then I did something that probably violated a dozen rules. I called the emergency number. Vernon answered on the 3rd ring, his gravelly voice rough with sleep or cigarettes or both. "It knows my name," I said without preamble. It spelled it out using the props and cars. Silence on the other end, long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Then, "When's your last shift this week?" "Friday. This is Tuesday night going into Wednesday. Don't come back after Friday. Take a full week off. I'll put someone else on rotation." He paused. "And son, when you do come back, use a different name. Tell everyone here you legally changed it. Pick something common, something that doesn't mean anything to you. Give the property a fake identity to latch onto. Will that work? Sometimes. Maybe. Better than nothing." Another pause. "You're handling this better than most, but you're also drawing more attention than most. That fake guard you saw, she was real once. Worked here in the 90s. Stopped leaving after a 6th shift. We still pay her salary to a bank account nobody accesses. That's the deal we made with her family. And with whatever has her now, the implications hit me like a physical blow. How many? How many guards are still here? 7 that we know about for certain. Maybe more that we don't. The property gives them back sometimes. Send them out during shifts to learn new ones. Best you can do is not listen, not engage, not believe them when they tell you it's peaceful." He hung up before I could ask anything else. I sat there, phone in hand, realizing that Vernon wasn't just a manager. He was a keeper, a warden, someone who maintained this place and managed the cost it extracted from its guardians. The job posting hadn't been advertising a position. It had been bait for the property's appetite. The rest of the night passed in a haze of paranoia and exhaustion. Every shadow seemed to hide a former guard. Every sound seemed to whisper my name. I followed the rules mechanically, going through the motions, counting down minutes until sunrise with desperate focus. At 5:12, something grabbed my ankle under the desk. I jerked back so hard my chair tipped over, sending me sprawling. There was nothing there. No hand, no presence, just empty space. But on my ankle, I felt the warmth of where fingers had been, and when I pulled up my pant leg, there were bruises forming in the distinct pattern of a handprint. It could touch me now, not just burn through fabric or create cold spots, but physically make contact, leave marks on my skin. The escalation was accelerating. 3 shifts, and I'd gone from confused observer to marked target. What would shift 4 bring? Shift 5? Vernon was right to pull me out after Friday. The question was whether I'd survive 2 more nights to reach that cutoff. Dawn came with all the subtlety of a gift from a vengeful god. I had never been so grateful to see sunlight. I documented the handprint bruise with photos, logged every detail of the night's events in writing so small I could barely read it. Then I fled. Wednesday night was worse. The property didn't wait for me to settle in. The moment my shift started at midnight, activity began. All the monitors showed my name again, spelled out differently each time I looked. Objects moved constantly, not hiding anymore, performing for the cameras. The tall figure appeared and disappeared in rapid succession, each time closer to the office. Voices called my actual name, not the generic sounds of phantom conversations, but my specific identity, repeated like a summons or a claim. And through it all, former guards appeared on the monitors. I recognized the woman from Tuesday night, but there were others. A young man in a 1980s-style uniform. An older woman who might have worked here in the 60s based on her clothes. A teenager who couldn't have been more than 16. They moved through the property like they owned it, interacting with objects, opening cabin doors, approaching the office in a slow parade of the consumed. I survived by treating it like a siege. Eyes on monitors, following rules, speaking boundary maintenance phrases until my voice went hoarse. I didn't eat the cookies or drink the coffee, afraid it might be drugged or cursed, or simply more connection than I could afford. At 4:33, all the monitors went black again, but this time when they came back on, they showed the interior of the office. Showed me, sitting at the desk, but filmed from impossible angles. Cameras that shouldn't exist, positioned in the corners of the room, in the ceiling, showing perspectives that made my skin crawl. I was being watched from inside my supposed sanctuary. The walls themselves had eyes. When dawn finally broke, I didn't make it to my truck before I collapsed, vomiting into the gravel from sheer fear and exhaustion. My hands shook too badly to turn the key. I had to sit there for 15 minutes, engine running, waiting for my body to remember how to function before I could drive away. Thursday I spent looking at apartments in California, jobs in other states, fantasizing about putting 1,000 miles between myself and this place. But I knew it was fantasy. I had 1 shift left. Friday night would be my 5th, and Vernon had pulled me from the rotation after that. I could survive 1 more night. I had to. Friday night, I arrived early. The sun hadn't even fully set when I pulled into the lot, and in the golden hour light, Starlight Junction looked almost beautiful, almost normal. The kind of place photographers would love, all vintage Americana and nostalgic charm. But I knew what it became in darkness. I knew what waited. Vernon was there, actually physically present for the first time, a man in his 70s with weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much. He waited by the office door, smoking a cigarette with the calm of someone who'd made peace with horror long ago. "You did good, kid," he said as I approached. "Better than most. 5 nights is an accomplishment here. The others," I said, "the ones who stayed. Could you have saved them?" He took a long drag, exhaled slowly. "No. By the time we realized they weren't leaving, it was already done. The property had them, root and deep. We just try to minimize casualties now. Pull people out before attachment becomes permanent. Why keep it open at all? Why not burn it down, bulldoze it, salt the earth?" Vernon's laugh was bitter. You think we haven't tried? This place exists because something that happened here opened a door that won't close. Burning it down just means the door's on empty land instead of property we can monitor. At least this way, we keep tabs on it, maintain the rules, try to save the ones we can. He flicked ash onto the gravel. You're one of the ones we can save. So tonight, you follow every rule perfect. No risks, no curiosity. You get a sunrise, you leave, and you don't come back for a week minimum. Understand? I nodded. He handed me a new addition to the manual, a single sheet of paper. Rule number 52. On your final night of any work period, leave something of yourself before you go. A photo, a trinket, something personal but replaceable. It satisfies the property's need to keep a piece of you and might spare you the worst of the attachment. Might. Nothing's certain here. You know that by now. The final shift began, and the property pulled out everything it had. A greatest hits compilation of 5 nights worth of horror. Every phenomenon I'd witnessed appeared in intensified form. The cold was colder. The voices were louder. The figures moved faster, approached closer. My name appeared everywhere simultaneously, a dozen locations at once, spelled in increasingly disturbing media. In dust, in frost, in what looked disturbingly like blood on Cabin 7's door. At 2:22, the office filled with that peripheral movement again, but this time I could see them clearly if I let my vision unfocus. Shapes, dozens of them, former guards and visitors, and whoever else the property had claimed over its decades of operation. They moved through the space like smoke, occasionally solidifying into brief clarity before dissolving again. The woman from Tuesday was there. So was the teenager. They circled me, not threatening exactly, but claiming, cataloging, welcoming me to a club nobody wanted to join. Last night, one of them whispered, always the hardest. The property knows you're leaving. It doesn't like to lose. I kept my eyes on the monitors, followed the rules, spoke the phrases. But exhaustion was winning. My vision blurred. My thoughts became sluggish. Around 4 a.m., I caught myself nodding off, jerking awake with the terrifying realization that I'd almost fallen asleep in this place. What would happen if I slept here? What would I become when I woke up? Coffee. I needed coffee, but I'd sworn off the provided thermos. I stood, planning to splash water on my face, force myself alert through sheer discomfort. That's when I saw it in the reflection of the darkened monitor screen. Someone standing directly behind my chair. The tall figure, no longer outside or in peripheral vision, but in the office with me, solid and real and close enough to touch. Rule number 12 said, don't look directly. But that was for 2 to 3 a.m. It was after 4 now. Different rules applied, except there was no rule for this. Nothing in the manual covered the tall figure being inside the sanctuary with me. I was off map, in territory where no previous guard had survived to write instructions. I didn't turn, didn't look directly. I grabbed the sheet Vernon had given me and read it again, desperate. Leave something personal. I fumbled in my wallet, pulled out a photo. My parents, taken at my college graduation, smiling and proud. It was one of my favorite pictures, genuinely meaningful. I placed it on the desk face down, offering a sacrifice, a piece of myself for the property to keep. There, I said aloud, voice shaking. That's yours. That's my piece. Let me finish the shift. Let me leave. The presence behind me lingered, and I felt that breath on my neck again, cold and earthy. Then it was gone. The office felt empty. When I finally dared to glance at the monitor reflection, nothing stood behind my chair. The photo remained on the desk, but somehow looked different. Flatter, less real, as if the property had taken not just the physical object, but something essential about the memory it represented. The last 2 hours dragged with nightmare slowness, but nothing else appeared. No former guards, no tall figure, no escalation. The property had accepted its payment, at least for now. At 5:58, I began the end-of-shift procedures. At 6 o'clock exactly, I opened the door to brilliant sunrise and the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. Vernon's truck in the lot, the old man leaning against it, waiting to make sure I came out. "You made it," he said, and I heard genuine relief in his voice. I'd made it. 5 nights survived. But as I drove away, watching Starlight Junction shrink in my rearview mirror, I knew it wasn't really over. The property had pieces of me now. The holes in my shirt, the bruises on my ankle, the photo that meant something. And more than that, it had my attention, my awareness, my knowledge of what existed in those shadows. I'd crossed a threshold, seen behind a curtain, learned that reality was negotiable, and that some places existed in the gaps between possible and impossible. When I go back after my week off, Vernon said I could, said the rules should protect me if I used a different name, maintained the boundaries, didn't work too many consecutive nights. The money was still extraordinary, and part of me, a part one didn't like to examine too closely, wanted to understand more, wanted to unravel the mystery of what Starlight Junction was and why it existed. Curiosity, the same thing that killed cats and guards, and anyone foolish enough to think they could master what they didn't comprehend. But another part of me, the part that woke up sweating at 2 a.m., even in my own apartment, that jumped at every shadow, that couldn't stop checking locks obsessively, knew the truth. I'd barely escaped. The property had let me go, but it remembered me. And if I went back, it would be waiting, patient and hungry, ready to claim what it believed I still owed. 2 weeks later, I got a text from an unknown number. Just a photo. The Starlight Junction sign at sunset, and standing in front of it, barely visible but unmistakable, a figure. Me, or something wearing my face, my shape, my presence. The me I'd left behind, the pieces the property had kept. I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and see an abandoned roadside attraction in the distance, I wonder how many other places like Starlight Junction exist. How many forgotten stops along forgotten highways harbor doors that won't close, presences that won't leave, rules written in the blood and sanity of guards who learned too late what they were really protecting. And I wonder about the guards who stayed, who became part of the property, who exist now in that liminal space between employment and imprisonment. Are they suffering, or did they find some kind of peace in surrendering to something eternal and hungry and wrong? I don't know. I escaped, but I'll never be free, because now I know what's out there in the dark, in the forgotten places. I know the shadows have eyes. I know some rules exist, not because someone made them up, but because reality itself been enough in certain locations to require instruction manuals for basic survival. I survived my 5 nights at Starlight Junction Motor Court, but the real question, the one that haunts me every time I close my eyes, is this: did I really leave? Or did I just become something that thinks it escaped, while the best parts of me remain in that office, circling the desk, waiting for the next guard to arrive? Some nights, I swear I can smell lilacs.